This discussion will include 8 accessibility design tips that you can use to help improve the accessibility of a website or product. Next slide. This lecture includes a substantial amount of tips and design suggestions on how to make websites, products, and services accessible. Next slide. The WCAG 2.0, also known as the Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines. This is a standard from the W3C consortium that outlines how to properly implement accessibility. The W3C is a group that came about as of the advent of the web in the 1990s and is a standards organization to help people understand and what they should do for standards on a variety of digital products. The current release version of WCAG is 2.0. There are 3 levels of compliance within WCAG 2.0. There's A, AA, and AAA. WCAG 2.0 AA is an agreed upon standard for most organizations to comply with for the purposes of accessibility. Next slide. One of the most important things for accessibility is color. You want to have color contrast, and that means verifying a strong contrast between text and background. This is an example from the Nielsen-Norman group of a particularly poor example of color contrast. You will remember maybe from earlier discussions that having white background and black text or black text and white background is actually the best way to have color contrast. So there's a myriad of different colors you can use today. There's also a bunch of tools available that will make you see if your color contrast will actually hit AA standard compliance with WCAG 2.0. Next slide. It's important not to use color as the only way to convey information. This is an example of one screenshot that you wouldn't want to use just because it only conveys the required information through color, and that could be difficult for people with color blindness. Next slide. Using color as a secondary way to convey information is fine, as long as there's another way to do it so somebody with a color blindness issue is able to see this. And as through much of accessibility, the best thing about accessibility is to have several avenues to do the same thing, so people can use a variety of different methods that might fit them, whether they do need that for accessibility purposes or just in general to give them more options. Next slide. Font size and type. This is very important. You want to be able to make sure that your website goes up to 200% and without a degradation at all of either the text or the pictures or just the website itself, because that actually is poor usability, but it's also poor accessibility. And you can do this in almost all browsers today very easily. And that's a very quick way to test to see how accessible your website is for font size and type. Next slide. Alternative text is another important aspect within accessibility, and probably the most well-known one. Really, what alt text is textual description of images, and you have to be careful about this because alt text is highly contextual. For example, null text can be used for alt text, so the screen reader will skip an image. This is particularly important when you have logos and icons because a lot of times those are only used for decorative purposes. So you can skip those because it's not important for the person using the screen reader to necessarily see those particular logos or icons if they're not important or contextual to the information they're trying to understand. There's usually 4 typical categories of alt text. There's traditional images, there's icons, there's buttons, and there's complex graphics. Next slide. Here's an example of a traditional image which you would see in a website where you have like the home page and you have a big picture on the front, and then there's particular pictures of individuals within the department. Now, with this, because there's a description of each of the 2 people here, you could actually just skip that image, or you could just say image of Eliza or Kalo or Gerald Fink in this situation, or a picture of biology on the main picture here. Next slide. Icons are an increasingly important part of various images too. And again, it's important to actually show these, or you can go null, or null as long as the heading of the annual giving, the leadership giving, the plan giving, because the icons here really are thought of as a bit more decorative for visual sighted users and really aren't important for somebody using a screen reader. Next slide. Buttons are important. It's about the function, but the form is not important. For example, seeing these 2 examples here, you'd want to be very careful to make sure that this is actually coded properly so that when somebody is going through this, they would know that the button is next and not just an arrow, and should be able to describe that properly. Next slide. Audio and video captions are increasingly important and almost a requirement for particularly the last couple of years. Realistically, every video should have captions. Auto captions are not enough, and new formats create new challenges for this, but it is an increasingly important issue. Next slide. For example, here's an example of captions. In the commencement program, you see here where it says, let's start with the map page near the front of the program, you'll see. And this is just showing whatever the audio is, it's complementing it with having text there so people can follow it. Part of the thing with captions that have evolved, eventually it was to help people who are hard of hearing, but it really is yet one of the other ways for multiple ways to get the same information. This is also very good for speakers who are ESL. It might be particularly good for soft speakers so you can read what they're saying if you couldn't hear them. It's also good to be able to have captions you can read at one's own speed, not the speaker speed, and you can change that accordingly in almost all software programs. It also does help with SEO as well. Next slide. Another important part of audio and video is to make sure there are user controls, and there's plenty of user controls. This includes user controls that can be operated with a keyboard, such as the play and pause buttons for audio and video. And you want to avoid automatically playing audio and video or changing images without the user able to stop it or understand that. Photo carousels, which were quite popular a few years ago and still are, they really must have user controls in that to be considered accessible as well as usable. Next slide. An increasingly important thing is transcripts, and this is particularly important for audio files like podcasts. It's good to have your videos in addition to captions, as you'll see that we have that in all of ours in the class. But a transcript alone is not adequate for a video. And just think about somebody who wants to listen to a podcast. They would need a transcript for that. Next slide. Here's an example of a podcast that has a transcript for podcasts. They're truly not accessible without them. So in this situation, you can download the podcast, you can play the podcast, but there's also a transcript here so that someone can read it if they couldn't hear it. Next slide. Another important accessibility tip is keyboard-only access. Users should be able to navigate a site only using the keyboard. This is in case they can't use a mouse or choose not to use a mouse. They should also have an individual indication of where they are on the site as they navigate through that. Keyboard-only access is actually one of the easiest things from accessibility to test. You simply unplug your mouse and use only the keyboard and see how things work and see if there's a logical pattern that you would go through to see that. The other important thing about keyboard-only access is it's one of the offshoots of so much like accessibility is for a lot of power users, they're very important and they want to be able to use that. Here's an example of our old website from our department. Is keyboard access. It would click from About to Accessibility to Assistive Technology to Usability to Contact and then go into the next group. But it's quite easy to make sure these are set up so keyboard access in a logical pattern, but it's very important to make sure you test that. Next slide. Another important thing is a fancy word called semantic structure. What that really means is that pages need to have a clear structure. Users should be able to understand the page quickly by scanning it. What this primarily means is headings. Use headings, lists, bulleted list, unordered list, ordered list, and paragraphs to indicate visual structure programmatically. For example, headings 1 through 6 are very important still to have on an HTML page. With that, we recommend you only have one H1 per page and then have H2 and H3 correspondingly and have them in a logical order so that the screen reader can particularly go through and be able to scan that information and report it out to the reader. But also it's very good for people who are visually scanning it just to know the size and how they would go about reading a particular page. Next slide. Here's an example of a visual of what a good semantic structure is. You see we have H2 as the hours and locations, and there's also research guide, which is another heading, but under each hours and locations there's the different libraries and things like that. So this is an example when you use one of the tools available, it will show you how the semantic structure is laid out in a particular page. Next slide. Linked language is something that's very important. And what this really means is just being much more descriptive than using the terms click here, learn more, and read more. You think about it, if, like in this particular page here, if there was 5 or 10 of these, a person who's using a screen reader would just hear learn more, learn more, learn more without any context. So for example, in this one, the enshrinement of the class of 2018, if it said learn more about the enshrinement of the class of 2018, that's fine, but just having learn more isn't sufficient. And that's very important, particularly if you have long pages and you have this click more, learn more, read more, or for more information. It needs to be contextual. Next slide. One of the other very important tips in accessibility is form and form controls. What this means is that if you have a text field, there has to be a associated visual label with the form field so that somebody that visually can't see it will know that event name is corresponding to this particular text field, or nature event is corresponding to this particular text field. This is also very easy to test because when you use the keyboard to go through, it should be able to map to that. And errors in this situation are very easily indicated. Next page. Here's just a list of tools that you can use on either your Mac or Windows that are built in with all of the OSs these days, just to choose and look through, and you can actually do your own accessibility evaluations. On Mac, you have Zoom Magnifier, you have a voiceover screen reading option, and you also have voice recognition. Within Windows, you can change the pointer size, they have magnifier, they have a narrator, and they have a voice recognition, so you can see how accessible particular aspects and websites are. That's the end of this presentation.